Hi, everyone. In true style of me and my issues at times with becoming a complete perfectionist, I have not put off intentionally doing this recording, but definitely just as an inkling, realizing that I was waiting for a perfect time and realizing that perfect time doesn't exist in my world at the moment. So we're jumping in. But over the last late end of 2025, I had the absolute honor, pleasure. I don't even know what the right word is, but it was so enjoyable to sit down with two of the most respected sports nutrition scientists of all time. One that has been very close to my career as a sports dietitian, and I feel so grateful to be mentored very closely by her. And the other who I've admired from afar for a very long time. So it was a pleasure to talk to him personally. And they come from two very different perspectives. And one question that was really shaking the foundations of how we understood and supported athletes was, the article that was released by Jeukendrup and his group around, does relative energy deficiency in sport actually exist? And the more I talk to you all, it was really feeling like we all really respected this journal paper, discussion and discourse that was happening, but felt like we needed some clarity of what that actually means to how we work with our clients. And to me, I didn't disagree with either paper. I saw points in both. I had experience in both points personally and in my career. And so I really was on this fence, right, of going, I want to hear both points. I don't want it to be an argument. I want it to be a discussion that's helpful to us as practitioners. And so I brought two together, two separate podcast episodes and video episodes for you to enjoy, just to really work through the discussion between Louise Burke and her group that were publishing around REDS, but also Aska's group that were publishing the paper around does it actually exist. Now, for those who I haven't met, I'm Alicia. I'm an advanced sports dietitian and co-CEO of Compete Performance and Compete Academy. And I work with elite female footballers for most of my days as a part of the dietitian group with the Matildas. But alongside that, we run a beautiful team that is the solution to sports nutrition, but in a way that really centers on the person and the behavior underneath the science of food. And this debate isn't academic for me. I've kind of, I guess touched on that earlier. It really just affects how I assess athletes and what I screen for and how I communicate with coaches and support staff and those key stakeholders, including the players and the athletes. So over the next two episodes, you're going to hear separate conversations with Professor Louise Burke and Professor Aska Jeukendrup about LEA, about REDS, and what's currently dividing that community, I guess, in those discussion points. And also just allowing you to gain a better insight into different ways of thinking. It is so important that we take ourselves out of the echo chamber at times and ensure that we're hearing different voices and getting ourselves really vulnerable in a productive and growth state mentality. And maybe to start, we wind back a little bit on the history of LEA and REDS. I was very fortunate to be working at the AIS when the first paper around relative energy deficiency in sport was released in 2014. And so I feel like I was in a really good position to get the whole backstory from the insider view. But in the 1990s, it was female athlete triad. It was something that researchers were noticing a troubling pattern in female athletes in particular, particularly in endurance sports, athletic sports, and weight class sports. They weren't getting their periods. They were developing stress fractures. Their bone density was declining at ages where it should actually be building. So in 1997, the ACSM, the American College of Sports Medicine, named this the female athlete triad. Three interconnected components, basically, that envisaged the inclusion of disordered eating, menstrual dysfunction, and also low bone density. It was a real breakthrough, I would say, in so many ways, in recognizing that these weren't actually separate issues. They were interconnected, and they were a health concern that also impacted availability and performance. But I think researchers over time soon identified that the real driver wasn't just disordered eating, it was energy availability. And low energy availability, or LEA as I will call it throughout this episode, is the mismatch between the energy an athlete consumes and the energy they expend in their training. When that energy availability drops too low, generally for the female, below 30 kilocalories per kilogram of fat-free mass is considered suboptimal or low energy availability. And for the males, we generally see that at 25 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass. And that's when we really do see those symptoms that impact both performance and health become very evident. So, fast forward to 2014, as I mentioned, I was at the AIS being a fellow, getting paid absolutely nothing, but living my absolute best life, being mentored and in the best possible place to launch my career at the Australian Institute of Sport. And the International Olympic Committee publishes a consensus statement. And then it really does aim to expand upon the framework dramatically and renames it REDS, Relative Energy Deficiency in Sport. The argument being that LEA doesn't just affect menstrual cycle. It doesn't just affect bone health. It affects metabolic rate, protein synthesis, CV function, immune systems, gastrointestinal health, psychological well-being, and basically every body system. And RED's positioned LEA is causing a syndrome which potentially dozens of signs and symptoms across multiple body systems as things that we should really look for. But also it appreciated that it wasn't just a female issue. It wasn't just a female-centered challenge that we needed to consider only in one gender of athlete. And it took off. Boy, did it take off. And it was so nice to see a different discussion, discourse, popularity around eating enough and eating more. But in many ways, it probably took off faster than the research was there for. And we started using RED's language pretty well colloquially. I think beyond, just the dietitians, just the sports staff, it really did go quite deep. And education programs were built around it. But it gets complicated in the way that, firstly, the female athlete triad group never left. So they actually stuck around and argued that female athlete triad shouldn't be obsolete or replaced by REDS. And also there's now the current controversy to add to that. As an aside, the female athlete triad group just released a new paper, actually. So that will be a discussion for another time, but definitely worth a read. But this is why we're here. The current controversy, I guess, over the last year as the different papers were released back and forward is, those critical voices got louder, I guess, and we looked deeper into the research of how much of this is opinion pieces or narratives and how much is solid evidence. And peer-reviewed papers started asking uncomfortable questions like, where's the evidence on these proposed consequences? Are they theorized? Are they real? How do we know they're not just confounded by other things like training load, genetic stress, or other factors like eating disorders? Can we actually diagnose REDS? Does it exist as a unified clinical syndrome? And have we created a framework that's actually too broad to be useful? So lots of different questions that I think are really valid and I think so important. And some researchers argue we've overextended that concept, that we're attributing symptoms to LEA without actually thinking of the whole entire person and looking at every aspect of their life, their presentation, and what could be creating these symptoms other than a low energy availability, and really making sure that we're asking the why, not just looking at the what, which is actually what we've been saying the whole time in our academy modules. So this is, a really interesting landscape in many ways of going, absolutely, we can appreciate this, but the bigger question, the most important thing is not just the what of what we're seeing, but appreciating why it's happening, what's the cause, and how many times can we ask why until we get to that root cause of what we need to consider for this athlete, for this person, for this squad. And it really matters in the day-to-day stuff so that we're not just telling people to eat more if we notice that they're fatigued. We're not just saying, we'll increase it here and you'll be fine. It's really appreciating that these things don't happen in a vacuum. And so we're going to hear from two voices in that. And you'll see that what they're trying to say together is actually pretty similar. There isn't huge controversies after all. It's probably lost in the research language that we see in journal papers, but I do appreciate that the story can sometimes be lost within that, and the nuance lost as well. So our guests are, first of all, Professor Louise Burke, and she is Chief in Nutrition Strategy in ACU, the Australian Catholic University in Melbourne, Victoria. She was previously Head of Sports Nutrition at the AIS, which is where we originally met and worked together for many years. And it's really shaped my entire approach to practice in the science space, but allowed me to dig deeper in the behavior space over the last few years as well. She's honestly a pioneer. I think the biggest thing is appreciating how much she advocated for our profession, for our profession's value, and created sports nutrition in so many ways. She tells the most beautiful stories about her starting places in sports nutrition, and we have so much to owe to her, and her voice in this has been so good to hear and have her story told. Her perspective comes from decades of seeing, real world consequences. She works very heavily in endurance sport, and very, very valuable. The other guest that we had on in a separate podcast episode to be released is Professor Asker Jeukendrup. So Asker is a professor of exercise metabolism and performance nutrition. He's the founder of My Sport Science. You may have actually come across plenty of his stuff or get his blog articles. The images are fantastic. The breakdowns are so helpful. So if you haven't discovered that yet, it's excellent. And his research on energy metabolism and sports nutrition interventions has fundamentally shaped how we fuel athletes. If you're thinking about how many grams per hour you're giving your endurance athlete, that's come from Asker's work. So he is absolutely instrumental, particularly in the endurance space, around carbohydrate metabolism. Like, you won't find better. Incredible. So we've really gone into this around, he's asked the big questions and questioning whether we have sufficient evidence to support it as a unifying syndrome, as in REDS. His perspective pushes us to critically think, which is amazing, but also about the frameworks we adopt in practice and how to approach those. I think I'd like to, before we jump into these episodes, I want it to be really clear that I didn't bring Louise and Asker together for a debate. These are separate conversations recorded at different times. But both discussions explore the same territory, the evidence base for LEA and REDS, the diagnostic challenges we face, the challenges that we have on the ground, the clinical utility of the frameworks, and what we as practitioners actually need to support athletes effectively. I want it to be about on the ground, not just in the research, in the science. So what I appreciated probably most about these conversations is that despite their different perspectives, there is so much so much unity in their messaging at the same time, and neither is dismissive or disrespectful. Neither has a simple answer. Both are, grappling with the different things of what we now need to do more of or do next and find out more. And I want you to go in and listen to both episodes with an open mind. Sit with the discomfort if something does sound different to what you've heard before, or you don't have a clear answer for, or that you've made a mistake with in the past. Like, sit with that. That's okay. That's why we're here. We're here to learn and grow and get uncomfortable. We're here to get out of our echo chamber and hear different things and hear different voices. So think about your own practice, your own frameworks that you're using, and just think of ways that you might improve that for your individual athletes, your players, your squads, or your different entities that you're working for. So I don't know where you'll land, which is fun. You don't really need to land anywhere, to be honest. I just want you to take these voices and go places with it, I guess, and feel a little bit more clarity of what it means to you in real life. So without further ado, I will stop chatting, but let's dive straight in. First up is my conversation with Professor Louise Burke on LEA, REDS, and what the evidence really does tell us about energy deficiency in athletes. And then the next one will be from Asker. So thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for listening in today with all the different sessions, and break it up if you need to, depending on the time you've got. But biggest thank you to the time that both Professor Louise Burke and also Professor Asker Jeukendrup gave to giving these voices. I do really appreciate it from two very busy humans. So thanks so much, guys. Enjoy.